This is Santiago Cobo.
We have a team of people who are doing the exhumations here, and then afterwards we have two parts of the report that has to be put together for the Truth Commission. One part is the actual forensic report about the evidence that's gathered in the exhumation, and the other part is the reconstruction of what happened here. In all of these communities, for years, people have been told it wasn't the army that did it, or it was a confrontation between the army and the guerrilla, or it was the guerrilla that did it. But through the forensic evidence, what we can see is that it wasn't an enfrentamiento, a confrontation between two forces, between the guerrilla and the army, and it wasn't the guerrilla because we know the caliber of bullets that the guerrilla had in their machine guns. And so the forensic evidence backs up the testimonies of the people so that their truth can be known. And it's not known just here, but it ends up being known throughout the country so that people can come to terms with what really happened here during the violence. What happened here on April 20th in 1981 is at 6 in the morning when men got up to go to work in the fields, which is what people do here. They grow corn for their survival. What they discovered was that their community was occupied by the army and also by the civil patrol. Men who were wandering off to go to work were captured by the military, and they were taken and they were put in a church. And then after they had collected all the men that were in the streets and out in the fields, they've had some of the young men in a school, and there was a house that was right by the school, and they put all the older men in that house by the school. And the men that were put into the school had their hands tied behind their back. They were laid face down on the ground, on the floor of the church, and they were kicked and they were beaten. And then dirt and leaves were thrown over them, so they were covered with dirt and leaves. Later, the older men who were in the house were taken by some of the soldiers to the site right behind me where the grave is being excavated today, and they were told to dig a grave. While they were digging that grave, the young men who were in the school were taken over to the church unaware that there were still people in the church. And they were told that they had to run and jump. And what they saw was a lot of dirt and a lot of leaves. And they began to run and jump because they too were being hit and beaten by the soldiers. And then they started to realize that they were running and jumping on human beings because they could feel the human beings moving below them. While all of that was happening, the elders of the community were digging the grave. And they were told they had to dig a deep grave. It had to be high, it had to be deeper than their height. And when the grave was done, they had to step into the grave. The elderly men believed that they were going to be killed because they were standing in the grave below all these soldiers surrounding them who were laughing at them and pointing their guns at them. But that wasn't what happened. Then the soldiers said, "Get out of the grave, we're not done yet." And so the elderly men were taken back to where the church was. And the young men from the church, the ones who had been laying on the ground and who had been jumped on and beaten and injured and whose arms were tied behind them, were brought out. And the young men from the school were brought out as well. And the soldiers separated these three groups of men into two groups. There was one on the left, which they referred to as Inferno, which is hell. The left is hell. And there was one on the right, and the right is heaven. The young men with their hands tied behind them who had been tortured in the church were put on the left side and told that they were hell. And the elderly men who had dug the grave and the young men who had been forced to jump and run upon the bodies of the other young men, the ones from the school, were put in the group that was called heaven along with the elders. And then the elders were told that they had to go and get their sons and their nephews, and they had to bring them up to the graveyard. And as they brought them up to the graveyard, the soldiers said, "Now you'll see what happens when you let your children help the subversives. Now you'll see what happens when you don't raise your children properly." And they brought them up, and they put the young men in rows in front of the grave, and then they put the elderly men on the sides to watch. And then the soldiers lined up and they began to fire at the men in the first row. And they fired in the front of their heads, they fired in their chests, and they fired in their stomachs. And the men fell into the graves. And then soldiers from behind started pushing the rest of the young men who were still alive into the grave, and they fired into the grave upon those young men. And then they told the elders that they had to bury them. And the elders had to cover the bodies of their sons and their nephews with the earth. Then the soldiers told them, "Now you've done your work for today. That's why you'll go to heaven. Go home and have lunch. You've done your work for today." In the Maya belief system, where the bones of the dead are buried, the spirits of the dead hover above. And in Mayan religion, whenever you have a religious celebration, you speak with the ancestors, which is why the religious celebrations are generally at the cemeteries, because this is where the ancestor spirits are. But the ancestor spirits can't be happy and calm or helpful or guide the living when they're upset, and they have to be upset when their bodies are in a mass grave with their hands tied behind their back. So they want an exhumation so that the spirits rest in peace.
Perdón mundo, perdón Gale, perdón sus, perdón Che, perdón ángeles. Rey de los ángeles, ángeles los rayos, ángeles la raya.
In the ceremony, the Mayan priest speaks to the gods and asks the gods for permission to disturb the bones so that the exhumation can happen. And after the priest speaks with the gods, the priest then speaks with the ancestors, with the spirits of the dead, and he explains to them that we may be disturbing the bones, but that we do it for good. And moreover, that God has given permission, or the gods have given permission for the bones to be disturbed. Then he asked that the spirits, rather than creating problems for us because we're disturbing the bones, that they should use all of their power and all of the anger and upset that they feel over the bad things that happen, that they should use that power for good towards us, to protect us while we exhume the skeletons. Today, the people in Acul want to have an exhumation for a number of different reasons. Firstly, because they want people to know that this massacre happened. They want the government of Guatemala to recognize how much they've suffered, and they hope that it never happens again. And that's part of the reason that they're willing to give the very painful testimony that they've given to us about the horror that they've suffered here. One person said to me, "I'm telling you what I'm telling you today so that there will be no more massacres. We want no more deaths of the Maya. We want no more massacres of our children. We do this for our children. We do it for our children's children." Maybe if we tell what happened here, it won't happen somewhere else, and we really hope it won't happen here again.